Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to talk about the Boston Celtics being the 2024 NBA Finals champions. And I want to dive into here the growth of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum. This is a duo that has been, I would say, scrutinized to some degree, considering the fact that many people who didn't really have this level of patience with them were constantly in the media talking about needing to split these two up and that they couldn't win with one another. And now we are at the point where we have seen the Celtics run their course here, let these players actually enter their prime and learn alongside one another. And I think that they are incredibly complementary. Now, in terms of the finals MVP debate, honestly, I don't think that either one of the results of Tatum or Brown winning should have really swayed your opinion on this series and who is the better player or whatnot. They were both massively impactful. They were both deserving, but ultimately the voters had to choose one over the other. Ultimately, the vote was 7-5 in favor of Jaylen Brown. Jaylen averaged 20.8 points per game, 5.4 rebounds per game, and 5 assists per game on 44 and 24% shooting splits. He was a massive part of shutting down Luka, like we just talked about. It was a combination, a team effort, of course, between him and Drew Holiday especially. But, Luka is always trying to hunt these mismatches. But, again, we saw Jaylen last night making a vocal emphasis of Luka is my man. I am going to limit him as much as possible. And that's an area where Jaylen has really taken pride in. I feel like he's always been a talented defender. We've seen at least at times of him being a little bit more, it's hard to say the exact word. He just kind of got caught at times not necessarily being fully locked in, especially when off the ball. He's always been a good physical on-ball point of attack defender, but at the same time, he would get caught on these backdoor cuts and such, and just these defensive lapses. He was prone to them, and that is just no longer the case. He is, it seems like, determined to make an all-NBA, or an all-defensive team, that is. When he was asked about not making all-NBA this year, he was more disappointed in the defense, which was never really going to happen off of this year alone, but we'll see if it's something that he can continue to work on. Whereas Tatum, he averaged 22.2 points per game, 7.8 rebounds per game, and 7.2 assists per game in this finals. He led his team in averages in those categories for the finals, but for the postseason as a whole as well. And it's the first time in NBA history for a player to lead a championship team in those stat categories and not win finals MVP. The other 5 were Bird, Olajuwon, Duncan, LeBron, and Jokic. But still, I don't think it's necessarily wrong for Jaylen Brown to end up winning this award. And I think that ultimately they have established themselves in such an elite way where coming into the league they did play very similarly to some degree as wings that basically their entire lives have been these score first primary options, and they had to learn to work with one another because as much as it seemed like Jayson Tatum sort of jumped out above Jaylen Brown, at least the All-NBA accolades would sort of back that up, Jaylen Brown is still a top 20 player in the league minimum, and maybe with the way that he showed up in the postseason, you could bump him up a little bit higher as well. But the way that, again, it was always going to be an interesting fit, where typically when we see these types of duos, it's usually a guard and a wing or a guard and a big. To have 2 wings, it wasn't necessarily the perfect fit to find a way for the 2 of them to play off of one another. But we saw Jayson Tatum really work on the development of his playmaking and making the right reads. Yes, his shot selection at times can be a little frustrating, but at the end of the day, he has become such a smart basketball player, and I think the vast majority of the time is making the right plays. And we've seen way more assists from Tatum to Brown than we ever have in any other season that these two players have worked with one another. And Jaylen Brown, on the other end, he has sort of become the defensive focused guy, where both of these talented players, but like I mentioned, Jaylen is now sort of the real point of attack guy on defense, and Jayson Tatum, because he doesn't have to extend that same effort, he is able to operate the offense, be the hub there, not to mention that he's also the team's best rebounder. So again, this combination of the two of them has just rounded their game out in such a satisfying way that between the two of them, inefficiency happens to any star in the NBA, but I really don't think that there is an overall hole in what these players provide. And it's interesting because I always sort of likened the idea of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum to succeed as they were coming up, as I compared them somewhat to the Clippers when they made the moves to sign Kawhi Leonard and trade for Paul George. And I always watched those Clippers teams, which, to be fair, we've been up to this point robbed of getting these two players actually playing meaningful minutes together for a lot of their career, and wondering how is this going to work out, having these two options who provide a lot of the same. And while the Clippers never necessarily panned out, and you could have used that as to, is this ever going to work out between Tatum and Brown? Again, they found a way to sort of hone in on different particular skills that they have that complement one another more so than to take away, and this feeling of redundancy. And ultimately, I do think that the success of these two players together is a little bit of a lesson for NBA franchises, and you can definitely span it across other sports as well in terms of this idea of patience. And Brad Stevens, the now general manager of the Boston Celtics, former head coach, he was asked by Rachel Nichols last night in terms of the criticism that these two have faced throughout their young career. And he said, quote, "It's stupid." And he said that it's because of the fact that Tatum and Brown have been playing in late May, early June through the majority of their career up to this point, that they overachieved so much in these early years that it felt like something was wrong. And there was a deliberate reason as to why the two of these players didn't work with one another, when the reality is they were still such young players, and it was going to take time for them to be fully ready for making this type of a deep postseason run and winning the finals. And it was interesting, Bob Myers of ESPN, who was the general manager of the Golden State Warriors for the majority of their dynasty, he was asked about the difference of them from 2022 to this year, and he just talked about the idea of they look far more ready, the way that they prepare, the way that they conduct themselves from a mannerism type standpoint, that they have been able to mature to a level that is conductive to winning an NBA championship. And ultimately, I think that it's Boston sports. So if you are not from New England, you are going to have zero rooting interest for Boston, because a lot of the time it feels like it's, Boston is just one of those fan bases that people love to hate. But the concept of having patience, of developing your two young stars together and letting them figure it out. Now, it's not always going to result in a championship. It won't always be the perfect fit. But to some level, what the Celtics have done through these past handful of years to build this championship team is what everybody that watches basketball should want to happen, which is developing these young stars and having an ownership group that is willing to spend money and make the right moves from a front office perspective. So, ultimately, again, Celtics are definitely not a brand that is going to win over fans along the way. But when you do look at the journey of Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum and how this organization has chose to run itself over the past number of years, it is something that I do think should be a style of ownership that your favorite team should try to replicate. But let me know in the comments section what your thoughts on that take are. But we are going to be taking our next break here, and when we come back on the other side, going to be diving into the Hall of Fame cases for Jrue Holiday and Al Horford now with this NBA championship added to their resume. So we're going to be diving into all of that. Stick with us. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.